Assalamu alaikum. Thank you for coming to the class on Imam Malik. My name is Muhammad Ali. I was asked to do a little introduction on myself, even though I prefer not to. I've been a part of Salam for the past 5 years or so. I was born in Kenya, moved over here when I was very young. I went to school at Merloma High School, graduated from Merloma High School, went to ARC. Transferred from ARC to University of California, Santa Cruz, and I graduated with a Bachelor's in Political Science in 2010. Since then, I have worked on campaigns and other political related things, and most recently I work at the Council on American Islamic Relations at the Sacramento Valley chapter. My passion actually is Islamic studies and Islamic knowledge, and I'm really fortunate, as well as the other brothers and sisters who are working on this, to have been selected by Imam Azeez to be a part of this committee. And to help teach this class, and also to just have the guidance that Imam Azeez provides. So enough about me, let's start with the person who you guys all came here to hear about. His name is Malik ibn Anas. Many of us have heard of Imam Malik before. So who is he? He was Malik ibn Anas ibn Malik ibn Abi Amr. He had a nickname, his kunya or nickname was Abu Abdullah. All that means is that he was the father of Abdullah. But he also had another nickname, a title. It was Imam Dar al-Hijrah. And the meaning behind Dar al-Hijrah, or Imam Dar al-Hijrah, is that he was the Imam of the abode of emigration, the location where everybody emigrated to during the early years of Islam. Does anybody know where that is? Medina, the city of the Prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He was born in 93 after Hijrah in Medina. And there's some debate on the exactness of that date. It's anywhere between 90 and 96 after Hijrah. And he died in 179, so he lived for 86 years. That's a really long time to live. He lived for 86 years, and he lived and died in Medina, and he spent his entire life in Medina. So he really, really loved Medina. He was an imam for about 70 of those 86 years, so you can sense the immense amount of respect that he had for the deen, and how much love he had for Islamic scholarship. During his time, Medina was the cradle of the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, and was the home of the Fatawa. Now just a little bit about the geography and the time period. Imam Malik lived amongst the traces of the companions anhum, and the Prophet ﷺ. Medina retained the aura of the early generations of Muslims, and allowed Imam Malik to consider it to be a place where you can derive your norms, Islamic norms from. He was so conscientious of the presence of the Prophet ﷺ that he took that verse that's found in Surah Al-Hujurat, وَعَلَمُوا أَنَّ فِيكُمْ رَسُولُ اللَّهِ. Know that the Prophet is amongst you. He took it literally, to the point that he actually would never ride on a horse or any beast or any steed, camel or anything in the presence of Medina. In the confines of the city, he would never trample on the ground on any animal, as long as the Prophet's body was resting there. He came from a Yemeni tribe. It was called Bu Asbah. And he had some prominent ancestors in his lineage. His great-grandfather was Abu Amr. He came to Medina after Badr, and he fought in most of the battles of the Prophet ﷺ after that. So that means that he was a companion. He was a sahabi of the Prophet ﷺ. His grandfather was Malik. Yes?
The Yemeni tribe, the name of it?
It's a Bu Asbah.
Bu Asbah?
Yes. The Yemeni tribe is Bu Asbah. So he was an Asbahi. His grandfather was Malik ibn Abi Amr. He was a tabi'in and a narrator of hadith, and he narrated from Umar, Talha, Aisha, Abu Hurairah, and Hassan ibn Thabit, the poets of the Prophet ﷺ. And when the third Khalifa, Uthman ibn Affan, was assassinated and the city of Medina was captured by rebels during his time, it was actually the grandfather of Imam Malik ibn Abi Amr, who went, and he was amongst the 4 people who carried the body of the Khalifa of Uthman and buried it secretly at night time so that nobody knew where the grave would be. So as you can see, his family, his ancestors had a close connection to the tradition of Islam. Also, on top of that, his father was a close companion of Uthman, his grandfather was a close companion of Uthman, and he was one of those people who was asked to compile the Quran in the Quraysh Qur'an, the one that we usually read today. His grandfather lived until the time of Umar ibn Azeez, and until the Umayyad period, but he did not live to see the Abbasid period. So he only lived during the time of the Khulafa al-Rashidun and the Umayyads. His immediate family. His father was Anas ibn Malik. Now it's not the Anas ibn Malik that we all know. Who's the Anas ibn Malik that we all know? The companion of the Prophet ﷺ. And the servant of the Prophet ﷺ. His father was not the servant of the Prophet ﷺ. This is a different Anas ibn Malik. This Anas ibn Malik was the father of Imam Malik, and he was paralyzed from the waist down. He was paralyzed from the waist down. And for many of us, we think that that causes us to not be able to provide for our families, but he still provided for his family even though he was paralyzed from the waist down, and he continued to make arrows. Bow and arrow, he made the arrows. He was an arrow worker. His brother was another, and interesting thing about another was known throughout Medina as a prominent scholar. How many of you guys have heard of another before? That's alright. Not many people have heard of another before. But it's interesting that people used to say about Imam Malik, he's another's brother. Right? They used to say, there goes Malik, he's another's brother. Right? And he was always referenced that way. Many of us have had that in our lives. My sister always complains about that when she's going through high school, and she says, you know, my teacher's always saying, oh, it's Muhammad's sister, and it's annoying to me. You know, and Imam Malik was going through the same thing with another. But it's interesting. You know, as the Quran says, وَتِلْكَ الْأَيَّامُ نُدَاوِلُهَا بَيْنَ النَّاسِ. It is in turns that we give these days to mankind. And as the time of another passed, it became the time of Imam Malik. Until people said about another, he's a Malik's brother. You know, so it's just interesting to notice how things move on. His mother was Al-Aliyah bin Shurayh. She was from the same tribe as Malik's father. So Imam Malik was full Yemeni. He was Asbahi. She was credited with charting the course of Imam Malik's life. And this is an important note to keep in mind, by the way, because as you'll see, many of the lives of the Imams that come after Imam Malik were actually heavily influenced by the mothers of the Imams. Same thing with Imam Shafi, same thing with Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal, and you'll continue to see that as time goes on. As for Imam Malik, it was a sense of honor for him to say that my mom, you know, influenced me. My mom had a great effect on me. He had a few children. Only a couple of them are really known throughout history. His daughter is known to memorize the Muwatta. And the Muwatta is actually the preeminent compilation of hadith before Sahih Bukhari and before Sahih Muslim and most of the 6 Sahih books that we have. So she memorized this entire compilation of hadith that Imam Malik actually put together. And she used to correct the mistakes of his students when they were recounting it. And I'm talking about like the entire thing, the sanad, the chains of narration, everything like that. She had all of this in her head. She was an extremely brilliant woman. But knowledge is not hereditary. And he had many sons, but one of the sons that we happen to know of was mischievous and energetic like Imam Malik was in his youth. And he happened to never follow the advice of his parents, and therefore he's not remembered in history. And he never really did much. I don't know what he did. He might have just played with pigeons like we'll hear about with Imam Malik. It's also important to note that the daughters of both Imam Abu Hanifa, who we studied last time, and Imam Malik both became scholars, but not their sons. He had a dream. His dream was that he wanted to go out and play. He liked to play with pigeons, but he also wanted to be a singer. Right? He had a beautiful voice, and he said, you know, one day I'm going to be the next Justin Bieber, and one day I'm going to be, you know, Puff Daddy or something. And it actually, he really wanted to be a singer really badly. And you can imagine him, I don't know if they had mirrors in those days, but you can imagine him just practicing in front of the mirror, just singing in the bathroom, you know? But he had 2 turning points. Obviously he didn't become a singer. None of us have Imam Malik CDs at home or anything like that. So he didn't become a singer. Why did he become a scholar? He had 2 turning points in his life. One of them was that Imam Malik used to he used to sit at home and eat dinner with his family. And he would eat dinner with his family at the table, and of course another was there, and dreaded another. He always seemed to have all the answers. He was the guy who was like just perfect, right? And Imam Malik one time was asked by his father, you know, he asked him a fiqh question about something, and Imam Malik just didn't know the answer. He was, you know, he was just a young boy, he didn't know the answer, and he was confused, and it just upset him. And his father said, you know, playing with pigeons has kept you away from the pursuit of knowledge. And this got stuck in the heart of Imam Malik for the rest of his life, and he constantly felt this sense of wanting to prove something perhaps to his father. And just keep that in the back of your head. The mentality of Imams as they go through learning Islamic knowledge and what propels them to greatness. This is also similar to Shabi. Anybody remember Shabi from last time? Okay, keep these names in your head. Shabi was a scholar who told Imam Abu Hanifa as he was passing by one day on the street. He thought he was somebody else, and he told Imam Abu Hanifa, before he was Imam, he told Abu Hanifa, business has distracted you. The business and debates and all this stuff has distracted you from pursuing knowledge and from going to the scholars. And so Imam Abu Hanifa also, that settled in his heart. So keep in mind that Allah SWT drops the little gems of wisdom in the lives of these prominent scholars, and that's exactly why they become who they become. The other turning point was that Imam Malik came to his mom and he told her, "Mom, I really want to be a singer. I have a beautiful voice and I just always wanted to sing, and the birds sing with me, and it's incredible." And his mom responded back to him. She smiled and looked at him and she said, "Malik, let me tell you something. Singing and good looks, they're coupled, and you have to constantly look good, and you have to constantly sing well, and you just have to do this for the rest of your life, otherwise you'll be out of a job." And this is interesting. That's the same thing today when they're looking for, anybody here watch American Idol? Astaghfirullah. But I'm just kidding. But that whole thing, it's the image that you put forth. It's the same thing that happened even in that time. You had to have a certain image that was there. And all his mom was telling him that if you don't have this image, at some point in your life, you're going to be irrelevant to the people. And she had the wisdom. She knew exactly, he also had the talent for memorizing things. And so she said, "Here, why don't we dress you up and I'll take you to this scholar, a man named Rabi'a." And we'll come to learn about Rabi'a later on. But his mom used that wisdom, that motherly intellect, and that motherly that guidance that she had, and she influenced him in such a productive way. And how many people in the world wouldn't have accepted Islam or wouldn't have practiced Islam if it wasn't for Malik's mom who guided him? What was his physical appearance like? He was tall and handsome. He was fair-skinned and unusually blonde hair. He had very unusually blonde hair. So much so that when he was young, whenever he visited his scholars, the teachers that he was learning from, he would knock on the door and the servants would say, "Oh, somebody's at the door." And then the scholars would say, "Who is it?" And the servants would always say, "Oh, it's Malik, your blonde student." Right? He had extremely blonde hair. And there's some accounts that even say that he was blue-eyed as well. So just think, he might have been German. This whole thing of him being Yemeni might not be really real, but so that's what he looked like. He had a large beard also that added to his aura. Many of us know that the larger the beard is, the more wise somebody seems. But don't take that from me, because I'm trying to grow out my beard.
Just to add, the tribe of Bani Himyar in Yemen, they call them Himyar because they are red and they are fair skin.
Yeah, true.
And probably
the same thing. Yes, definitely. So he had characteristics that were unusual for people living in Medina at the time. And he was from Yemen, where this characteristic, as the brother was mentioning, was prominent. As he aged, his beard actually turned white, and it became whiter and white until it just became really silver, and it added to his wise appearance. What was his character like? He was known as being a zahid. And a zuhud is actually the practice of austerity. But many of us think that zuhud and austerity means that you walk around and you kind of, just like bend down like this, and you're like, "Oh brother, assalamu alaikum," just assalamu alaikum, and your clothes are tattered, and you carry your stuff everywhere you go, and you have a poor look to you, and just, that's the way that we usually think of austerity. But Imam Malik, just like Abu Hanifa, had a different vision of austerity, a different vision of zuhud. And their vision was that zuhud is of the heart, right? Meekness is not something of the appearance. It's not something that makes you, that looks, it's not something of your looks. Imam Azeez actually was telling us about this imam from Chicago, prominent imam, who one time, if you don't mind me saying this, Imam Azeez, one time he saw him driving, this like extremely expensive car. And the first thing that comes to your mind is, this is an imam, he shouldn't be having this thing. But then once you realize that this is the status, he has the ability, Allah has blessed him with money, and all he's doing is just expressing that blessing. He's not going out of his way, but he's just expressing the blessing. And that's the same thing that Imam Malik actually did. He used to dress extremely well. He used to dress extremely well, and he had a ring also that said, Hasbi Allah wa ni'mal wakil. That Allah is enough for me, and He is the best of guardians. He had a soft handkerchief also that he used to carry around. You know, those handkerchiefs that you just keep in your pocket right there to look really nice. He had one of those, and what he would do is when he'd go to prayer, he would take out the handkerchief and he would just put it down on the ground. You know, put it down on the ground and put this and do a sujood or a sajda right on the handkerchief. And the reason why he did this, somebody asked him one time, "Why are you doing this, Imam? You know, why are you putting this handkerchief right there?" And he says, "I do it because I don't want people to see the black spot on my head and they say this is a great abid." And so he was really, really, really aware of how people perceived him. He was also a health nut too. If anybody here is a vegetarian and anybody here like watches their weight and everything like that, Imam Malik used to make sure he ate the best foods that he could possibly get. So just keep that in mind also. His behavior, he took his work very seriously. In fact, while talking, he never joked. So Imam Malik just never joked. If you cracked a joke in Imam Malik's presence, he most likely would just stare at you. And they actually used to say that if anyone laughed in his halaqah, his students would come up to you and beat you up. So, you know, imagine you're in the halaqah of Imam Malik and he says something and you laugh, and you're like, "Oh, Imam Malik, you're so funny," you know? And he's just looking at you, and then his students are looking at you and they're like, "Come on, man." You know, just right afterwards we'll go outside back and we'll beat you up and rough you up a little bit. So that's, you know, he used to have that kind of mentality where he was very serious in his work. And actually, while we were doing the research for this, we actually came to think that Imam Malik might have OCD. He used to pay attention, great amounts of attention to every single aspect of his life, every single little tiny detail. He would actually go as far as to put scents on people. You know how sometimes you're just walking around and you're like, "Oh, you know, I really like this scent, and you know, this person's not smelling too good." Imam Malik would go up to you and just dabble that scent on you. You know, and some of us would feel like that was invasive, but Imam Malik's like, "Hey, you know, just a sunnah, smell good." So Imam Malik used to go as far as to do that. He was just continuing with that OCD aspect, he was so particular with aspects of the sunnah, so particular in the aspects of how the Prophet used to live his life and how he used to behave and act, that he didn't shave the area between his mustache and his beard. So this little area right here, he never shaved it. And the reason why he used to not shave it is because he said Ibn Umar, Abdullah ibn Umar, the son of the famous companion Umar ibn al-Khattab, he said that Ibn Umar never used to do this. He used to always never shave this area. And Ibn Umar followed the sunnah, and therefore I will not shave it either. And it's just the early remnants of this concept called taqleed, which Imam Azeez will cover later on. But he used to be very, very precise in exactly how he do things. He almost, I don't want to say imitate necessarily, but he would replicate the way people behaved, the way that righteous people behaved. He expected everyone to follow the sunnah, and he didn't differentiate between young and old, male or female, politicians or commoners, old or rich. If you were in the masjid and you weren't praying according to the sunnah, Imam Malik would make sure that he told you that you weren't praying according to the sunnah. This was something that he was very, very, very particular about. He also did not fear powerful people, and this comes into play later on in his life. But there's one instance that really exemplifies this, and it was that Imam Malik was in a meeting with the Khalifa. The Khalifa Abu Ja'far al-Mansur, who was the Abbas Khalifa. And the royal protocol at the time was that when the Khalifa sneezed, nobody said anything, right? If the Khalifa sneezed, you just shut your mouth and you just accepted that he sneezed and you don't say anything. And so Imam Malik knew that this wasn't a tradition that was natural to Islam. It was actually a tradition from the Persians. It was a Sassanid tradition that in the royal protocol that you just don't say anything when the Khalifa sneezes. You don't want to embarrass him, so don't say anything. But Imam Malik didn't accept this. So Abu Ja'far al-Mansur sneezed, right? And everybody was scared. They were like, don't say anything. And Imam Malik looked around and he said, Ya Amir al-Mu'mineen, yarhamkallah. And all these people were looking around, they're like, "Oh, hey, man, just don't do that. Don't do that. That's not acceptable." And Imam Malik was just, he was just very adamant about it. And when he left, one of the guards actually raced after him just to tell him, it's a royal protocol. You just don't say anything after the Khalifa sneezes. You don't want to be in prison. You don't want these things to happen to you. And Imam Malik just didn't say anything to him. And so another time came, and the Khalifa sneezed. I don't know if he had a cold or something like that, but he was just really prone to sneezing according to the story. And so he sneezed, and the Imam just jumped at the opportunity, right? And he was about to say rahmatullah, but what he did first was really beautiful. He asked him, Ya Amir al-Mu'mineen, O leader of the believers, would you like the ruling of shaitan or would you like the ruling of Allah? And it's just like, this is brilliant, right? Because nobody's going to say, I want the ruling of shaitan, just stay quiet, don't say anything to me. He said, I want the ruling of Allah. And so Imam Malik said, Yarhamullah. Right? And after that, he broke the protocol in the royal protocol in a palace. And this was something that Imam Malik constantly tried to do in his life. He attempted to change society and the system from within. He didn't actually come out from without and then try and change it. Unlike Imam Abu Hanifa, who was very active and tried to, change the system through rebellion. He actually wanted to change it from within. And so he was working from within to do it. Now his livelihood, unlike Abu Hanifa who inherited the family business, Imam Malik joined his brother in his trade as a cloth merchant. However, in his early career as a student, he encountered many hardships, so much that his daughter used to weep from hunger at nighttime. And it's actually really, really sad, because the story goes that one time somebody was, one of the Khalifas sent one of his spies to check up on the people in Medina. And so the spy of the Khalifa looked inside Imam Malik's house, and inside Imam Malik's house, he noticed that Imam Malik was stirring something in a pot. And as he looked closer, he noticed he was just stirring rocks. He was stirring rocks and he was telling his children and his daughter, he said, food is coming, just don't worry about it, food is coming. And this is something that's happened throughout Islamic history many different times with people who were very poor. But he kept telling his child, don't worry, don't worry, food's coming very soon, until they fell asleep. So he was very poor. But his quest for knowledge compelled him to go as far as to dismantle the roof of his own house. Right? We need the roof, obviously. When it rains and everything like that, he dismantled the roof of his house and sold the wood, just so he can go out there and study Islam. When he became prominent, he would only accept money and gifts from the Khalifa, unlike Imam Abu Hanifa, who never accepted any money from the Khalifa. But he would not use it for himself in extravagant causes. He used this as a political move in order to keep the channels open between himself and those who were in power. And it was actually a very, very effective way of doing it. Eventually this worked, and Al-Mansur, Abu Ja'far al-Mansur, the Khalifa, made sure that the mayor of Medina would not pass a law without making sure that Imam Malik actually approved it beforehand. So as you can see, his working in the system worked to his benefit to some degree. And if you'd like to know exactly where he got his money from also, he used to have, one of the great imams at the time was Layth ibn Sa'd, who was a great imam, and he was a great supporter of Imam Malik. And Layth ibn Sa'd used to send Imam Malik a lot of dyes. He used to send enough dyes for all of Medina, the little dyes to dye your clothes and dye your hair and everything. He used to send these to Imam Malik. And these would go for about $1,000, I think, a piece, right? So that's a lot of money. And Imam Malik would sell these and he would make money off of it. So that's exactly how Imam Malik would make his livelihood. That is just the introduction. Right after this, Imam Azeez will continue to go through the environment and talk to you about the underlying principle that captures the life of Imam Malik. So Jazakumullah khairan, and please welcome Imam Azeez.
Again, I wanted to, inshallah, start by thanking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for blessing us with the opportunity to come together as a community to study the lives of really such great inspiring figures in the history of Islam. I think it is also, it behooves us as well to recognize the efforts of the team that put this class together. And I would like to thank Brother Muhammad Ali, Kamran, Sister Reem, Sister Nushin, Brother Omar Gardizi, and Brother Ayman for working so hard over the past few months, 6 or 7 months, by the way. This team has worked on doing the research, and my job was really to take the script that they wrote, process it, and kind of just put my own touch to it, but 90% of the work was theirs. So, as I said last time, please make dua for them. These are the scholars, inshallah, of the future. As I said last time, every lecture we would like to cover 15 aspects of the scholar's life. And I think I mentioned them last time. There will always be an introduction, time period, geography, physical appearance, personality, upbringing, turning point, livelihood, political environment, teachers, intellectual circumstances, methodology, travels, students, and summation of life. And I said last time that all of those for the life of each scholar will eventually lead to one defining character, one defining quality for the life of each of these scholars. Last time, Abu Hanifa, the defining quality of his life was, if you remember, what was that? Those of you who attended last time, what was it? Not moving on without giving an answer. What was it? The defining quality for the life of Abu Hanifa. He had a schedule. He was good at that, but that wasn't the defining quality of his life. Yes?
He believed in changing things from within?
He believed in changing things from within. No, that's Malik. Abu Hanifa, I think, was more of an activist. He believed in rebellion, actually. Yes? Yes, Jazakallah khair. Thank goodness one person out of 200 remembered what I said last time. That's exhilarating. Jazakallah khair. Yes, it was ra'i, the reliance on opinion that is inspired by reason. Right? And the Hanafi fiqh is primarily defined by that. Now, if we were to think of a notion of a similar characteristic or quality that defined the life of Imam Malik, it was, as Brother Muhammad Ali said earlier, taqleed. These are terms you're going to memorize, and inshallah I will ask you. Next time I will actually embarrass some people. I'll be like, Muhammad, what was it? Or Aisha, answer the question. So please memorize it. Ra'i for Imam Abu Hanifa, that is, if you go home with nothing but that word, then it would be sufficient. Because everything else revolves around it. Taqleed means imitation. The imitation of the behavior, the character, the opinions, the qualities, the demeanor, the knowledge of someone who's righteous. And knowing, we're talking about environment, knowing that Malik grew up and studied and taught Islam in the city of Medina, then naturally, people that he looked up to and imitated were the Sahaba and their students, also known as Tabi'in. So he was inspired by his presence in that city, in that, among that generation of people who studied Islam directly from the Prophet ﷺ. The entire setting of Medina was built around a certain value system. A value system that is derived directly from the Quran and the character of Muhammad ﷺ. And honestly, when you think about it, if you are in a city where most people around you are scholars, are ulama, most of them, knowledge was rampant, unlike the experience of Abu Hanifa, where he had to go out of his way to study and learn and find a scholar. In Medina, knowledge was rampant. Remember last time? His barber was a scholar. Right? Everyone in Medina is a scholar. In fact, there was 70 different halaqas led by great scholars, Sahaba and Tabi'een, in Medina that are taking place simultaneously throughout the life of Malik. Right? 70. And each one is attended by thousands of students. So imagine, how big was the population of Medina anyway at the time? Now, if you are in a city where, and again, I promise you, everything will revolve around taqleed. If you are in a city where there's so many great people around you and they're all knowledgeable and they know everything, if you live in Sacramento and there is 500 of the greatest scholars of Islam around the world, and then there is an issue that comes up, what would you do? Contact Sheikh Google and do some research? Or do some reasoning on your own and use your ra'i? Or you're just going to ask one of these guys, right? Because the mere presence of those great scholars actually discouraged ijtihad. It discouraged using reason, because why even bother? The scholars are there, they're just, they have done it. They have done the research, so I just need to go back and ask them questions. So the presence of so many scholars in one place actually led Imam Malik to, and scholarship in Medina in general, to rely heavily on the imitation of those scholars rather than coming up with your own views as Abu Hanifa did. And so knowledge and ilm in Medina was a daily routine. It was basically a structural aspect of life in Medina, as opposed to life in the frontiers where Abu Hanifa lived. Now there's something that is extremely, extremely important here. If you have all these Sahaba in Medina, and you would like to know what the Prophet ﷺ said. Now this is the third or the fourth generation. So you have the Prophet, you have the Sahaba, the Tabi'een, and some of Tabi'een, and then the generation that came afterwards. So if you were to collect hadith, what is the natural process? If you live in the generation of, let's say, the students of the Tabi'een, then you would find someone from the Tabi'een themselves in order to narrate the hadith. And that Tabi'i will get the hadith from a Sahabi, and the Sahabi gets the hadith from the Prophet ﷺ. Now, it is okay to scrutinize the lives of all the Tabi'een or their students, to scrutinize the lives of any other man, but the mere presence of Sahaba made it difficult for the narrators of hadith to scrutinize their opinions, because they said those are the companions of Muhammad ﷺ, and hence the hadith, the fundamental rule in hadith collection, which is quite rampant among scholarship in Sunni Islam, which is kullu sahaba udul. All the companions are just, all the companions are honest. And I will show you in a few minutes how that actually poses a great dilemma in the life and the course of Malik's scholarship. So all of the Sahaba are just. We don't scrutinize what the Sahaba say. Only ilm al-rijal, they call it, which is the science that scrutinizes the lives of the narrators of hadith to verify whether or not they're honest, they have enough sincerity, knowledge, scholarship, and so on and so forth. So they used to study their lives, and if someone is known to have lied, they would reject that person and not take a hadith from that person. Does that make sense to you? But they would not subject the companions of the Prophet ﷺ to that same scrutiny. Based on the Islamic or the hadith notion, the science of hadith, kullu sahaba udul, and inshallah I'll talk about this in a second in detail. But despite all that, this sort of streamlining of ilm in the city of Medina, it was actually quite a tolerant city to really strange practices. For instance, there was an extremely, extremely vibrant Qadariyya movement in Medina, for instance. Qadariyya was, with our modern definitions, would be considered heretical, right, in many of its premises. But Medina tolerated their presence. They would argue with them and have debates about things, but never encourage violence or anything like that. Medina had an extremely well-established tradition of the arts, for instance. Like it had many singers. Right? And they have their gatherings and stuff like that, and scholars frowned upon music and singing, but again, Medina tolerated the presence of such things. Also, part of the environment is really, as Brother Muhammad said earlier, is the influence of the Imam's mother. And when she took him to Rabi'at al-Ra'i, a great scholar that we'll talk about later, she actually told him, I want you to spend most of your time learning his character, learning his manners, and a little bit of time learning his ilm, his knowledge, right? It matters more to me that you absorb the character. And again, this is very important because I talked about this last time. You could be a great scholar with PhD from Harvard in Islamic studies, right? So as far as ilm is concerned, you have everything. But you could be a womanizer, you could be an alcoholic, you could be, all kinds of, you would never inspire people. Knowledge becomes dry. But those scholars had both. They were successful at the personal and social life, and they were successful in their intellectual lives as well. That's why they became role models, right? We don't talk about Western scholars in such sense. We're not inspired by them. We might be inspired by their work or their devotion to their work, but not their character. Everyone had huge flaws in their characters. So that was, some information about the environment in which the Maliki madhab evolved. Now let's talk about intellectual circumstances. And again, Medina was a society that heavily relied on the oral tradition of transmission. So it is always someone said that I heard so-and-so say, that I heard so-and-so say, that the Prophet said this, or Abdullah ibn Abbas said that. So what is it that you need the most if you were to thrive as a scholar in a society that placed so much emphasis on oral tradition? What do you need to have? Memory. You need to have impeccable memory, right? As a matter of fact, Imam Malik, he started his career as a collector of hadith. You need to know that. Unlike Abu Hanifa, who started with ilm al-kalam and then subscribed to fiqh because of the whole thing about Ahlul Bayt that I talked about last time. But Imam Malik started as a collector of hadith. So he would go to his teachers and he has a string. I mean, imagine like in our halaqas, for example, we take one hadith every day and we spend like 2 hours just studying one hadith. But the scholar would basically recite 35 ahadith with their chains. So he would say, so-and-so heard that so-and-so heard that so-and-so heard that the Prophet ﷺ said, and then they would go to the matn, which is the body of the hadith itself. And Imam Malik would go into the room with a string. And every time his teacher recites a hadith, he would tie the string one knot. So that counts as one. And then he'd keep doing this, memorizing what the imam, what the teacher says, until he goes into like, whatever, 35, 40 knots. And then he goes outside and he spends about an hour going back and reciting all the ahadith, making sure that he actually memorized them. Right? And you're standing there and then, okay, wait. I can only remember 32. And I have 35 knots on the string. Oh man. And then he goes inside and he recites all the ahadith again to his teacher in order to figure out which ones he actually missed. And he keeps doing this over and over and over again until he memorizes completely the ahadith. But society at the time was also changing and people were recording stuff. It wasn't just about the spoken word. And there's an extremely important point to make here. Again, goes back to taqleed, the difference between taqleed and ra'i. And that is, if you remember from last time, Abu Hanifa allowed or discouraged his students to write his opinions. He discouraged them, right? Except for one that he, for the most part, allowed him to write things down. His name was Abu Yusuf. Now, Abu Yusuf wrote things down, the things that Abu Hanifa was really, really sure about. But everything else, he would tell them, just don't write anything, please. With Malik, it was different, because many of Malik's teachers actually allowed their students to write. And Malik himself allowed his students to write the opinions that he was really, really sure about. Right? Now, think about that. Why does the fact that not recording things would yield ra'i, and recording things would yield taqleed? Anyone would like to take this on? No? Yes?
Ra'i, ijtihad. You can do your point of view, while taqleed, exactly what it is, what you have to.
Okay, yeah, I think you're on the right track. So do you want to add to that?
I mean, when you have the text in front of you, you're more likely to refer back to the text. There's less likely to be an error of memory, so you can't even debate the actual thing. But if you have the text preserved, you just follow the text.
Very good. Very good. Was that another thought, brother?
Yeah, I was pretty much saying the same.
Okay.
I would because points of view would affect your right in order to form your own right.
Good.
Ra'i is all about figuring it out for yourself, whereas if you're going to taqleed, you would refer back to the text.
Right. So what the brothers here were saying is basically, when things are documented, there is little room for disagreement, because students will always say, okay, what did Imam Malik say? Well, here it is, page 19. That's what he said. So there's little room to make up stuff or to use your own opinion or some process of reasoning. And it is not, again, to suggest that Ra'i was all, let's just sit back and come up with our own stuff. Ra'i was still based on what the general limitations of Islamic law would allow. And he was only tackling issues in which we did not have nusus, in which we did not have scripture from the Quran or Sunnah or anything like that. But with Imam Abu Hanifa, it was a different process, because it was mostly Abu Hanifa said this, and then another student would say, well, no, yes, he said this, but he meant that. Right? And then they would process it based on, their own inclinations and convictions and so on and so forth, and that led to the evolution of Ra'i, while the other process led to the evolution of taqlid, or at least was one of the contributing factors. Now, going back to the issue of hadith, and I don't think, I'll say things every once in a while that you guys don't have room for in your course packets, so please, just if you want to write stuff down on the back or something. Some people raise this point all the time. Hadith and the reliance of hadith. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, deen was transmitted to us through the Quran and through the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, and Sunnah was relayed to us through the hadith, right? But hadith in and of itself sounds like, from a pure logical standpoint, sounds like an extremely unreliable process of transmission, because how we make sure so-and-so said that so-and-so said that so-and-so said that so-and-so said that the Prophet said. I mean, how do we make sure that this is actually reliable? Because again, the Quran was preserved, via Allah's promise. إِنَّا نَحْنُ نَزَّلْنَا الذِّكْرَ وَإِنَّا لَهُ لَحَافِظُونَ. We are the one who revealed this book, and we guarantee its preservation. But the same doesn't apply to hadith, right? So people are saying, sometimes it's sound, sometimes it's sahih, sometimes it's da'if, sometimes it's hasan, sometimes it's marfu' and this and that. So how do we make sure that the ahadith that are coming to us are sound enough for us to issue rulings and to come up with teachings about Islam and to say this is halal and this is haram? This comes up all the time. And I asked that same question to Khalid Abul Fadl a few years ago down at UCLA. And this is what he said. He made a reference to what he called the oral epistemology of the human experience. The oral epistemology of the human experience. It sounds really like an academic term that doesn't mean anything. Oral epistemology of the human experience. In layman's terms, it means most human knowledge, most of the things we know about life and world and history is actually stories, right? Give you examples, because when he said this, I rejected it, and I said, no, wait a second, that's actually not true. Physics is based on empirical evidence and lab tests and experiments and stuff like that. Same applies for biology and geography and history. It's not just based on stories, it's based on science. And he says, yes, but that only applies to the investigators and the scientists and the researchers that partook in such processes. You weren't there at Harvard when they discovered the electron, some 50 years ago, right? How many of you have been to China before? 4, 5, 6 people. How many of you have been to New Guinea? Thank you. How many of you think that New Guinea exists? How do we know that? Because there's some really reliable people told us. We heard that story in our geography books. Some guy, his name is Andrew Martin, who wrote my geography book. How do I know that this guy's actually reliable? Right? I heard it from my teacher, some guy named first name Jack. Jack. Right? How do I know that Jack is saying the truth? Some guy on CNN was reporting a story about New Guinea. His name was Bob. How do we know that he's actually saying the truth? Right? And hundreds and hundreds of stories like that all supported each other, and that created a strong conviction that New Guinea as a country actually exists. Although none of us have ever been there. Do you understand what it means? So hadith, when you have all these narrations, all these chains of people who listen to the Prophet ﷺ, and they are narrating the chains, and those chains support each other and yield knowledge that looks similar, right? They support each other, and hence the notion of tawatur in the science of hadith. So I just wanted to put that point out there because I think it's important. Now with Imam Malik, going back to the comparison between Malik and Abu Hanifa, what I told you last time, if you remember, if anyone would like to remind the group, inshallah, it would be great. What was the dynamic that motivated Imam Abu Hanifa to embark upon his career of activism? What was the one major thing that happened in his lifetime that motivated him to do it? Anybody remembers? Yes? Yes, the persecution of Ahlul Bayt. I talked about this last time. The persecution of Ahlul Bayt was, and his exposure to that, including, the turmoil that some of his own teachers had to go through, that motivated him to just put his life out there and come up with a system of jurisprudence that can constitute a platform by which he can stand against Umayyad aggression and so forth. So fiqh was sort of a secondary outcome to a career of political activism. That's what I argued last time, and some people might actually be offended when they hear that, right? But that is sort of my social science examination of the life of Abu Hanifa. Now, we need to look for a similar dynamic or something that also motivated the life of Imam Malik as well. It certainly was not the persecution of Ahlul Bayt, even though his heart was bleeding about that. But remember, he lived in Medina. He did not live in Iraq. He did not witness those rebellions that took place, except for just one that was concluded really quickly in the Hijaz. And I will mention that, inshallah, in a few minutes. But the motive that drove Imam Malik to do what he did was still activism. Okay? It wasn't just ilm, it was activism. Because again, think about it. Why did he transition from a muhaddith, from a collector of hadith, to a faqih? I mean, there were so many of the people of Ahlul Hadith that collected hadith, but he transitioned into something else. He evolved into a faqih. And the reason that is being presented here is Abu Hanifa's desire to come up with a template of what a good human society would look like, and possibly perpetuate that template into other parts of the Muslim world and use it as a model by which people can live their lives, right? He was still responding to the aggression of the Umayyads in his own interesting way. I mean, think of it this way. Abu Hanifa was a political scientist or a social scientist. Abu Hanifa was an activist, and Malik was a social scientist. In what sense? Because when it comes to politics, you have politicians, you have activists who are always, giving politicians a hard time. You have political scientists who are studying the political phenomenon, and you have lawyers that are making money from everyone, right? So think of Imam Malik as a political scientist who is trying to come up with this social paradigm that he can export into other parts of the empire, and it becomes his way to stand against Umayyad aggression. As opposed to Abu Hanifa, who wanted to develop political and activist plans and engage in rebellion, and so finance rebels, which basically tries to dismantle the system from the outside. Okay? Now, how could he have derived that perfect model of human society, and where would he get it from? The city of Medina. You now see where all taqleed business came from? The city of Medina presented that model for him. Great people, great society. There was no profanity. There was no illicit activities or behavior. He didn't have to worry about identity crisis as Abu Hanifa had to deal with, right? It was for him a perfect society. So why don't we take everything that the companions and their tabi'een said and try to put that in the form of a code of law that we can send all over the empire and change the society, and that will compel their political leaders to change as well. Right? Does that make sense? Alright, so Medina was that model that he used in order to perpetuate that idea. Now, the notion of taqleed did not actually latch on in the Maliki madhab, which is very interesting. I'll show you in a few minutes why that was the case. It's definitely seeped into the Shafi'i madhab, and I will talk about that, most certainly the Hanbalis, but not the Malikis. Even though the founder was an activist who used taqleed in order to create a model to change the Muslim societies, but taqleed did not latch on, and inshallah I will tell you why in a few minutes. Alright, so we go inshallah into knowledge areas, the things that Imam Malik covered in his scholarship. He was, number one, very interested in the evolution of the deviant sects, what he considered to be deviant sects at this time, Qadariyya, Jahmiyya, Murji'ah, Mu'tazila, all these groups that really gave everyone else a hard time because they kept the Muslim mind busy with these polemics of Greek philosophy rather than focusing on building the economy or production or developing political institutions and so forth. He was extremely hurt by the waste of time that is going into these debates. But at the same time, he also understood that the public, the general public, the average guy, is easily influenced by what those people are saying. So what do I do as a scholar? Formulate a response that will really tackle the issue in an academic way, in a profound way, that will hit the nail on the head and risk the fact that the general public will not understand what I'm saying, or formulate things in a very simplistic way that to satisfy the general public but will not be viable for academic discourse. Because again, he was going after the leaders of those groups. You see the dilemma that he found himself? That's why he developed two forms of ilm. One of them that basically was the science of al-khawas, the knowledge for the elite. And that is possibly similar to what we would call today academic knowledge. And al-ilm al-awam, which is the knowledge that is basically for public consumption. And this is a genius distinction. One that we actually still use today. So you have academics who publish articles, the average guy just reads a physics article published in the physics journal from Yale, and he will not understand a single word, right? Students in physics programs, they understand that language, they understand the lingo, right? But then at the same time, sometimes, journalists like The Economist is really genius in doing that. The Economist, for instance, it takes these complex, profound academic articles, translates them into a language that the average person can actually understand. So you can still get a taste of what knowledge. There was actually most recent article. There was an amazing summary of an article, an essay that was published recently on aging, for instance, and ways by which scientists are tackling the issue of aging and going after certain cells and stuff like that. It was presented in a genius way. So Imam Malik was aware of that. The general public, not because people are, God forbid, stupid or anything. It's just because people are busy and they might not have the enough knowledge to understand the distinction between what is fit for academic discourse and what is fit for public discourse. Imam Malik learned not only the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, but he also learned the fatawa, the religious edicts of the Sahaba and Tabi'een as well. So he started collecting what Abdullah ibn Abbas said, what Abdullah ibn Umar said, what Abdullah ibn Amr said, what Abdullah ibn Mas'ud would say. He would collect the sayings of not only the Prophet ﷺ, but of the Sahaba as well. It is interesting, however, that Imam Malik had a huge issue with many Sahaba, right? Which goes back to what I was saying earlier, that there is a fundamental dilemma that Imam Malik had to face. He considered all the Sahaba to be udul, as I said, to be just and fair. But at the same time, he had very unfavorable views about many of the companions that I will share with you, inshallah, in a minute. And that definitely is an intellectual challenge that he had to face. He was also interested in fiqh al-ra'i, and fiqh al-ra'i is not ra'i as in Abu Hanifa's ra'i, but fiqh al-ra'i is about how to reconcile between the differences between what some of the companions said. So Abdullah ibn Mas'ud would say something, and then Ibn Umar would say something else, and they seemingly sound contradictory, and the average guy is like, who do I believe? What do I follow? Something that to the present day we kind of suffer from, right? So he was so interested in his academic scholarship to find a way by which we can reconcile these opinions based on al-maslaha al-mursala, based on the what is good for the general public. It was almost like more of a utilitarian approach. How can we summarize fiqh in a way that the average person will understand and it will actually directly touch their lives? Let's talk a little bit, inshallah, about his teachers. And I really think that Imam Malik achieved something that is really incredible, that has been unprecedented at his time. And that is, some of his teachers later on became his students. And I would like to cite Sufyan ibn Uyayna in particular, because although he was not one of his primary teachers, but Sufyan ibn Uyayna was one of the great fuqaha. And he eventually became Imam Malik's student. And you know, if I go to college and I attend a physics class, and I graduate, and then I get my PhD in political science, and then the physics teacher that used to teach that physics class decided to switch careers and then enrolled in a program and became my student in a political science program, that sounds like something that would actually happen. It could take place in the modern world. But with Imam Malik, some of his teachers became his students in the same discipline. Right? It wasn't a cross-disciplinary process. It was Islamic studies professors that eventually became his students. This is how vast his knowledge has become over the years. And I really think that what's particularly helped Imam Malik, something that Abu Hanifa didn't have, and that is the presence of the Sahaba and the Tabi'een and the reliability of reports that he was getting from them, and his transition from hadith to fiqh. So he had hadith under his belt, and it was much easier for him to embark upon a fiqhi career, unlike Abu Hanifa, who just had ilm al-kalam under his belt, which was actually frowned upon at the time. We talked about Rabi'at al-Ra'i, Rabi'a ibn Abi Abd al-Rahman. And Rabi'at al-Ra'i was called al-Ra'i not because of the Abu Hanifa kind of Ra'i, but Ra'i because he had, as they say, Ra'yun Sadid. He was very wise. He made really good decisions when it came to his career as a scholar. So they called him Rabi'at al-Ra'i. Rabi'a actually had very unfavorable views of Ra'i in general and of the fuqaha of the Iraq. The scholarship in which Abu Hanifa himself grew around, Rabi'a had very unfavorable views of that. He actually used to say, it's as if the prophet that was sent to them is different than the prophet that was sent to us. But subhanAllah, even though Malik stayed with Rabi'a for about 7 years, he disagreed with his teacher on so many things. Right? He always disagreed with him, but he would not show that disagreement. All that disagreement started to surface after he eventually had to abandon the halaqah of Rabi'a ibn Abi Abd al-Rahman. And actually, it is said that historians drew parallels between the manner by which Malik left Rabi'a and the manner by which Wasil ibn Ata left Hasan al-Basri. I talked about this last time as well. Wasil used to be a student of Hasan al-Basri for about a decade, and then eventually he left and he founded which madhab? The Mu'tazili madhab, right? And Imam Malik had to eventually leave Rabi'a and establish the Maliki madhab. But he was so respectful and loving to his professor that he would basically, there was an incident of a scholar, Az-Zuhri, was visiting Rabi'a and asked him a fiqhi question, and Rabi'a answered. And then Imam Malik, Az-Zuhri could see something on his face. He felt uncomfortable. Ya Malik, tell me, do you have another opinion? And then he said, no, my teacher already answered your question. So he took him outside later and he told him, Wallah, you have to tell me the truth. I saw something on your face. You didn't like what Rabi'a said, did you? And he said, well, I really think that he made a mistake. I think that the right answer is this and that. And Az-Zuhri said, Wallahi, what you said is the truth.
So he'll start? You're not going to talk, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes, start with.
And again, going back to taqleed, even though he disagreed with his teacher, but he would not show that. He would just keep it to himself because, again, the premise was follow your teacher. Imitate your teacher, even if there's a disagreement. You shouldn't necessarily bring it to the fore. And you may or may not agree with that, obviously, but Imam Malik did. Alright, talk about the second scholar, Abdullah ibn Hurmuz. Abdullah ibn Hurmuz, as his name suggests, he was of which descendant? Persian descent. And we know that the Strait of Hormuz, remember the Persian Gulf? They don't call that after Abdullah ibn Hormuz. But it's a Persian name. And if Hamad for Abu Hanifa was the primary scholar, Ibn Hormuz for Malik was his primary teacher. Right? Ibn Hormuz focused more on taqleed, focused more on imitating the Sahaba, focused more on less reasoning and more following. And Imam Malik loved that because he always just wanted to stay on the safe side. By the way, as you will see, most of Imam Malik's teachers were actually not Arabs, right? Rabi'a was not an Arab. Ibn Hormuz wasn't an Arab either. And Nafi', the one that I will talk about in a second, wasn't Arab. As a matter of fact, those three were also slaves in their own right, believe it or not. Which tells you that the definition of slave in Islamic tradition is completely and drastically different than one we understand here in the West. Ibn Hormuz was not Arab. He was actually disabled. He was blind. And he was a slave of a former slave, subhanAllah. And Malik stayed with him 7 years, just as he did with Rabi'a. Now, here's one beautiful thing that Imam Malik used to do with his teacher. And again, you guys need to understand this because learning the knowledge of the deen, see, this is the most beautiful thing in life.